Hello everyone, and welcome back once again to Translationborne, the series where we're taking a look at the translation of Bloodborne. And since I have a little bit of time here at the start of the episode, I thought I would begin by going back and examining some of the dialogues that we got before. Specifically, I want to look at the people who've been shut up in their houses around Yharnam, because there's a larger point I'd like to discuss. So, to refresh your memory, here's an audio clip from the first house whose door we can knock on.
You that outsider? Well, sorry, but I don't want anything to do with you. Trot along, will ya?
So I noted before that the final line, "Trot along, will ya," was something that I thought was a really good atmospheric translation. But there's something else that's notable about it. The word choice here is distinctly British, which matches the Cockney accent. A more American version might be something like, "So go on and get lost." Of course, if you're a native English speaker, I imagine that's something you picked up on. The accents and word choice of a number of the speaking characters are decidedly British as well. Here's another example.
Lads, you've come up. He'd open the door the night of the hunt. Away with you, now.
Notice that he starts out by calling us a lousy offcomer. I'd never even heard that particular word until I started playing this game. Apparently, it's a Lancashire word for an outsider, a person from somewhere else who will never quite fit in. It fits the context of Bloodborne perfectly, but as someone from the US, it's a term that I would never have thought to use. And the reason I really wanted to focus in on these kinds of word choices was that it brings up the larger issue of what's called localization. Now, that's a term that, if you've played a lot of games, you've probably heard before. It refers to the process of taking something and making it local in character. It comes up a lot in regards to translation, because whenever you're translating, you're inherently taking something from one culture and putting it into another. When cultural context is different, sometimes you have to change things around to achieve a similar effect in another language. Jokes and puns are often brought up as great examples of this, because they represent points where literal translation wouldn't actually convey the same information to the speaker of the target language. And if you want to know some relatively accessible examples of this from video games, I would say that the names of the Pokemon are actually a great place to start. Voltorb, for instance, in the original Japanese, is Bidididama, and to a native English speaker, that just sounds like a nonsense name to a fantasy creature. But there's a meaning to it in Japanese. If you were a native speaker, you would know that Bididi is actually one way to represent the sound of the buzzing or humming of electricity, and Dama, in this case, means ball or orb. So to a Japanese player, that combined with the external appearance of the Pokemon makes perfect sense. So for the English, rather than simply translate or transliterate the term Bidididama, the term was actually localized to Voltorb. Volt filling in for the idea of electricity, and orb obviously to represent the idea of it being a ball. Good localization choices like this can actually provide foreign audiences a closer experience to the original than a literal translation. Of course, localization does extend beyond mere wordplay. Graphical changes can be made too, and sometimes things that are innocuous in one culture can be offensive in another, so changes get made there as well. One of my favorite gaming examples of this comes from Earthbound. At one point in that game, you fight members of the Happy Happy cult, and the images that represented their hats seemed like they were too close to the KKK. So the translation team removed the HH letters and also put little fuzzballs at the ends of their hats. And the point of all that is to emphasize that localization is a wide-ranging and important part of bringing a game to many different countries. I'd like to bring this back to Bloodborne, but first this item description. Saw Hunter Badge. Badge crafted long ago at the workshop. Attests to one's prowess as a hunter of beasts. The workshop is gone, and no group recognizes this meaningless badge, except the messengers in the bath, who understand its profundity. Certain things can only be entrusted with a hunter in possession of this badge, or so they believe. Okay, there are some things to note about that translation, but first I'd like to finish the point I was making about localization, because it was a deliberate choice on the part of the localization team to have the game sound as influenced by UK English as it does. So, why make that decision? Well, I think that has a lot to do with the literary genres that the game is drawing from. Of course, if you look around on the internet for influences on this game, you're going to find a lot of information on Lovecraftian horror. And while I certainly agree there's a strong influence there, it's hardly the only one. Large sections of this game, arguably the entire first half at least, are more influenced by Gothic horror. This ought to be plain enough just to see from the looks of Yharnam, because the Gothic genre of literature was highly influenced by the Gothic style of architecture. And as you can probably see, pretty much every building in Yharnam is Gothic in nature. But another death means another cut loading screen. So both in order to build my case and because I think it's interesting, I wanted to take a look at some of the other characteristics of Gothic literature. I'll read them off a list I found online. Atmosphere. In the Gothic novel, the atmosphere will be one of mystery, suspense, and fear, the mood of which is only enhanced by elements of the unknown or unexplained. Sounds like Yharnam to me, but let's keep moving. Clergy. Often, the clergy play important secondary roles. They are often weak and sometimes outrageously evil. While we haven't gotten far enough in the game to really examine this, the Healing Church does play an important role. But anyway, next on the list is the paranormal. Oftentimes, Gothic fiction will contain elements of the supernatural or paranormal, such as ghosts and vampires. In some instances, these supernatural features are later explained in perfectly natural terms, but in other works, they remain completely inexplicable. This is another point where I think it's safe to say Bloodborne fits in pretty obviously. Next is melodrama, also called high emotion. Melodrama is created through highly sentimental language and overly emotional characters. The panic, terror, and other emotions can seem overwrought in order to make the characters and settings seem wild and out of control. I don't know if I'd call Bloodborne melodramatic, but emotions certainly seem to run high, which is something else that the dialogues that prompted me to start talking about all this to begin with really help bring out. Next up, omens, typical of the genre. Omens, or portents, visions, etc., often foreshadow events to come. They can take many forms, such as dreams. Arguably, we haven't run across too many of these so far, but the game does foreshadow things in mysterious ways. Now we come to setting. The setting of a Gothic novel is typically a character in its own right. Gothic architecture plays an important role, so the stories are often set in a castle or large manor, which is typically abandoned. Other settings may include caves or the wilderness. Again, I think this point speaks for itself. Finally, the virginal maiden in distress. With a few exceptions, most Gothic villains are powerful males who prey on young virginal women. This dynamic creates tension and appeals deeply to the reader's pathos, particularly as these heroines tend to be orphaned, abandoned, or somehow severed from the world without guardianship. This last point is kind of interesting in how it applies to Bloodborne, but we don't have much evidence for it up to this point, so I'm not going to really discuss it. Anyway, I hope from reading all that, it's pretty clear that, at least up to this point, Bloodborne fits pretty well within the Gothic genre. And what's one of the other defining characteristics of Gothic novels? Well, they're strongly associated with England. The first book that's really considered Gothic is The Castle of Otranto. It was written by Horace Walpole, who was from the UK. And the authors of a number of other notable texts from the genre, including The Mysteries of Udolpho, Frankenstein, and Dracula, are all from the UK as well. So in a setting that's as influenced by Gothic horror as Yharnam, I feel like it's the perfect choice to have its inhabitants speak with English that's clearly from the UK. I believe that was a solid localization choice. But enough general theorizing about things for now. Let's get back to something concrete. There was one line from the Saw Hunter badge we picked up earlier that I wanted to discuss. And by that I mean the line that says, "The workshop is gone, and no group recognizes this meaningless badge except the messengers in the bath, who understand its profundity." A more literal translation of the Japanese there might be, "The workshop is now gone, along with any group that would require proof of your prowess, but the messengers in the bath may find some meaning in this badge." You'll note, of course, that the official translation is much more concise. But it's the part of the official translation that says the messengers understand the badge's profundity that interests me. It makes it sound like the badge is truly profound and only the messengers can see it. The literal translation only emphasizes that the messengers may find meaning in the badge. But here's another item. Bold Hunter's Mark. Dangling upside-down rune etched in the mind of a hunter. The image upon this parchment allows one to envision the rune with clarity, allows a hunter to awaken again without losing blood echoes, a trick that seems nearly too good to be true. Alright, so to briefly finish that point I was making before I started reading the item description, I think the difference in phrasing there really gets at what to me is part of what's at the heart of this game. It makes you question what's real. So when I run across a phrase in the Japanese that says, maybe the messengers find meaning in this, which in the English is worded like, only the messengers understand its profundity, I feel like there's a sense in which the different nuances are adding to the question that the game is exploring. And on that note, let's take another look at the Bold Hunter's Mark. There's two things I'd like to discuss here, one of which is major, while the other is more of a minor point. So to deal with the smaller issue first, take a look at the very last line. It says this is a trick that seems nearly too good to be true. And I don't know about you, but the way that that's phrased makes me think, well, maybe it is too good to be true. Maybe there's some kind of catch to using this item. That's not the case, of course. Bold Hunter's Marks do allow you to awaken anew without losing any blood echoes. But I like the way that that wording kind of throws that into question. I think it's appropriate, too. Even a more literal translation of the Japanese would get you something like, a convenient trick indeed. The wording is very suggestive, and since this is a game that, like I said before, makes you question what is real, I feel like it's a really appropriate phrasing. So that's the minor point I wanted to make about the Bold Hunter's Mark. The major point I'd like to make is actually more of a game mechanic, which is why I call it a more major point, because it has a larger impact on the game as a whole. I am referring to the translation of the term blood echoes. But since I just got that item drop, let's look at the description. Antidote. Small medicinal tablets that counteract poison. Used to treat ashen blood, the baffling sickness that ravaged old Yharnam long ago. These tablets only provide short-term relief. The ashen blood ailment eventually triggered the spread of the beastly scourge. So that's a pretty straightforward translation, although I do think it's kind of fun that the use of the word triggered is pretty much the same in both English and Japanese here. But to get back to the subject of blood echoes, the Japanese term is actually fairly different. Literally, the characters used here, which would be read chinoishi, means something more like the dying wishes of blood. That final term, ishi, is frequently used to refer to an aim or a goal that someone had before they died that they never managed to accomplish. It's frequently used in the phrase ishi o tsugu, which means to carry on with someone else's wish after they've died. It contains the idea of inheriting someone's will or succeeding them. But now let's chat with this fine citizen.
Wretched outsider. Trying to fool me to open this door. Heavens, the depths of depravity.
Interesting translation choice there, but I'll get back to that in a minute. First, I'd like to finish the point I was making about the Japanese version of blood echoes, chinoishi. What that term seems to imply is that there's a kind of lingering will left in the blood. We, as hunters, gather that will to ourselves and use it to get stronger. After all, if you want to level up, buy items, upgrade your weapons, or create chalice dungeons, you're going to need those blood echoes. So keep that in mind while I talk with this NPC.
Who are you? I don't know your voice, but I know that smell. Are you a hunter? I'm just really looking for my mum. Daddy never came back from the hunt, and she went to find him. But now she's gone too. I'm all alone and scared.
Sorry, little girl, but for now we're gonna say no.
Oh, alright. Well, thanks, Mr. Hunter, for talking at least. Take care on your hunt.
Anything else to say?
Thanks for chatting. Please be careful out there.
Okay, that was mostly a straightforward translation, but there's one point that I'd like to come back to. First, though, I'd like to finally finish my point about blood echoes. Because now that you have an idea of what it means in Japanese, I'd like to take a look again at the English. So at first, using the term blood echoes might seem a little bit odd. But remember that, like with the term insight, this has to be a term that's used for a game mechanic. So if you use an alternate translation, maybe something like blood will, which sounds closer to the literal Japanese, you'll end up with people saying things like, "Oh no, I just died and lost 8,000 blood will." And let's face it, that simply does not sound as good as saying you lost 8,000 blood echoes. Also, keep in mind that character limitations are still in play. So if you were to go with something like dying blood wishes, which sounds a little bit more appropriate in the situation I just brought up, you may have trouble fitting something that long into the game wherever the term blood echoes appears. And along with that, it's also a bit of a mouthful. Finally, and in a more positive sense, consider the connotations of the term echo. In a way, it's a sound that goes on even after its source has ceased to be. So in a sense, it fits this game very well. I look at this translation choice as a more extreme version of the one that was made with the term cold blood that we looked at before. But now we have more items to read. Torch. A common torch formed by wrapping a pine resin-drenched cloth around the end of a long stick. Hunters choose torches not only because the hunt leads them to the darkest nooks, but also because certain creatures they encounter are possessed of a deathly fear of flame. This is a pretty solid translation. I especially appreciate the use of the word deathly in the phrase deathly fear of flame, something that I'll talk about in just a second here. But first I'd like to read the description of the other item I picked up. Shining coins. Various coins that are particularly luminous. There are very few uses for spare change during the hunt, but these will serve as guides through the darkness. Or one could save them until morning, if it ever comes. Alright, and that's the last interruption I expect for the next little while. So first let me finish my point about the word deathly. The Japanese word being used there is byoteki. This is something of a pun, as the term kind of both means sickly and abnormal. So by talking about a deathly fear of flame, you get a similar idea. There was also an interesting line in the Shining Coins translation. The final line of the official version is, or one could save them until morning, if it ever comes. A more literal translation of that might be, or you could save them for the faraway dawn. So the official translation goes a little bit further than the Japanese in suggesting that perhaps morning will never come. I happen to like this change since I feel it's in the spirit of the game, but I think it's an interesting one to point out. Now, let's take a look back at some of the lines of dialogue that we've gotten so far in this episode. We'll start with the woman whose door we knocked on.
Wretched outsider. Try and fool me to open this door. There's the depths of depravity.
So perhaps the most interesting line here is the one where she asks if you're trying to fool her into opening the door. And it's interesting because in the original Japanese, it's an entirely different line. A more literal version of the latter part of that dialogue might be, as if anyone would open their door to one of you. How disgusting. So I'm not sure why this particular version was decided on, but I suspect that it has a lot to do with emphasizing the attitude that Yharnamites have towards outsiders. Remember, there was a similar dialogue with someone inside a house earlier who asked who'd open their door on the night of the hunt. So that establishes that during the hunt, most Yharnamites don't open their doors at all. This woman, on the other hand, is very pointed about excluding outsiders. That's something that comes through in the official translation very strongly. She knows we're an outsider, thinks we're trying to trick her into opening her door, and then casts aspersions on our moral character by saying, "Heavens, the depths of depravity." Again, ultimately I'm not sure why they went this particular route, but it was certainly an interesting choice. Now I'd like to go back and take a closer look at some of the last lines that little girl had to say to us. There's two of them. The first one was this,
Take care on your hunt.
and the second one was this.
Please be careful out there.
So the Japanese for those two lines is exactly the same. Here they are again with the Japanese voice acting. First there's this,
お仕事頑張って。
then there's this.
お仕事頑張ってね。
And in both cases, a more literal translation would be something like, good luck with your work. The thing is, the Japanese term being used here is something of a catch-all. The term is gambaru. Perhaps most literally, it means something like work hard. But with the way the word is most commonly used in society, it's basically a general term of encouragement. In fact, it can be used in so many different situations that one person I know, who is a native Japanese speaker who's taught themselves English, has trouble distinguishing when to use phrases like good luck as opposed to hang in there or go for it. So in this particular case, you're looking for a term of encouragement that is also a form of parting, since this is the girl's way of dismissing you. Looked at in that light, I think it makes perfect sense to translate the phrase as take care. So the first of those English translations, take care on the hunt, I would argue is a very effective translation. Then, once you have that first line established, it makes sense to me that you would have a variation of it for the repeated line. Namely, be careful out there. And this ties into something that I've touched on before, but I've never really discussed in detail. That is, you want to avoid having your translation sound too obvious. Sometimes this is referred to as avoiding translationese. Basically, what happens is that one language will often have a frequent way of expressing a certain idea. So in this case, there's the term gambaru. Last episode, there was the phrase shikkari surundayo. And because these phrases tend to pop up a lot in Japanese language usage, if you use the same kind of translation for them every time, it can sound a little bit weird. This is especially the case if it's a phrase that isn't used so much in the corresponding language. One of the readiest phrases that I can think of in Japanese would be shikata ga nai. Literally, that means something like, it can't be helped. And if you always translate the phrase shikata ga nai as, it can't be helped, it's going to stand out a lot. This can get to the point where if you know both languages and are frequently looking at translations, sometimes you can see a phrase in English and think, oh, I know what the Japanese for that must have been. This can be distracting enough for a certain subset of people, but if you repeatedly use the same lines, especially in situations where they might not sound totally natural in English, even people who don't speak the language are going to catch on, and that phrasing is going to stand out. Or it might just sound weird in the first place. If you say to someone, I wanted to be here on time, but my car broke down, so it couldn't be helped, that's probably just going to sound a little bit off. It would be better to say something like, I wanted to be here on time, but my car broke down, so there was nothing I could do. And ultimately, that's the kind of solution that I think you should be looking for when you're doing a translation. You want to find a phrase that fits a given situation, but doesn't sound weird. And I feel like this is especially important when the line is actually going to be spoken by a character. You might be able to get away with a little bit of awkwardness if people are just reading something, but when that's a line of dialogue that has to be delivered, people are much more likely to pick up on something that doesn't sound quite natural. And it's also important to remember that as you develop strategies to deal with these kinds of phrases, you also want to be careful of using the same solution over and over again. So in the case of the little girl here, you have a spoken line with a general catch-all term in the Japanese that uses the same phrase practically twice in a row. Again, I think they did a good job making this sound natural. Now to read the Hunter set. Hunter hat, one of the standard articles of hunter attire fashioned at the workshop. A fine piece of hunter attire that provides stable defense to anyone facing Yharnam's beastly threat. Recognizable by its withered feathers, this cap is fashioned after one of the old hunters. Okay, that's the hat. Now for the chest piece. Hunter garb, one of the standard articles of hunter attire fashioned at the workshop, accompanied with a short cape to wipe away blood. A fine piece of hunter attire that provides stable defense to anyone facing Yharnam's beastly threat. Allows one to stalk beasts unannounced by cover of night. That translation is pretty straightforward. The only thing that's different is the second set of lines contains a little bit more information in Japanese. A more literal version might be, a fine piece of hunter attire that provides stable defense when facing the inhuman beasts that writhe in Yharnam. I suspect that was cut for character limitations, though. And with that, we reach the end of another episode. As always, I welcome any questions, comments, or suggestions that you may have for me. Thanks for watching, everyone.